And if you look at the Charlie Ma movement, I told you that Charlie Ma movement has its limitation. And then another characteristic is to achieve high level of capital accumulation through the forced saving mechanisms of consumption sacrifice, and then to promote economic growth by preferentially investing this capital in heavy industry. So I want you to explain that too. So the government spend a lot of money and government focus heavy and chemical industry, right? But how this how this investment is actually possible? They actually need the money, right? How can you actually access the money fund? There are a lot of several ways to do that. If you look at the Park Jong-il, you can actually find the answer. You can access the fund by foreign country. That's actually the easiest way. Or they export to, they trade, to export things to other country, and that's how you make money. So there are ways to make money like that, and that's the easiest, right? But North Korea, it didn't do that. Instead of it, it actually sacrificed consumptions of the people. The people, if they got money from the government, that's the planned economy, right? So if they got the money from the government, with that money, they do not spend, they do not consume the things. Instead of consuming things, they are forced to save the money. And then if they force to save the money, then the money will go to the bank, and this based on that, all banks are nationalized, right? That's the planned economy. So since the bank are nationalized like that, and the government could reinvest the heavy and chemical industry sector based on that money. That's how this works. So it's if you can't sell things, like if you produce a lot of irons and metals, um, steels, then you should actually export to make money based on that. But they couldn't sell, they couldn't make money out of it. So instead of it, that's how they invest, keep investing in heavy and chemical industry sector. And this heavy and chemical industry is not really for the wealth of the people, it's wealth of the military. So the government spend the steel and iron for the military power, military uses, not for real to economic growth. So even though they produce a lot of irons and steel, it doesn't make the country rich because this money actually didn't go to the wealth of the people. It goes to the military power. That was the problem. And then how the government keep investing? It's a forced saving mechanism. That's actually the key, right? Where's money come from? Forced saving mechanism of consumption sacrifices. That's the strict problem that North Korea has. Economic growth is intended to achieve externally through the method of self-reliance and internally by mobilizing residents through mental stimulation. And then the problem is they didn't implement Lieberman method. So if they would accept and implement Lieberman method, things might be changed, but they didn't, and they get rid of Kapsan fraction, right? And then instead of using incentives to the workers who contribute, they wanted to keep use mental stimulation, like Charlie Ma movement. So mental stimulation, identity spirit doesn't last long enough to maintain the economy. So the economy gone I mean, it's getting worse and worse because of these two mechanisms. And there are other problems too. The internal limitation of North Korean economy was due to the shortage of raw materials. The problem, when I compare North and South Korea first, I emphasize that South Korea doesn't have enough resources, while North Korea have a lot of natural resources. But why do say due to shortage of raw materials? Production facilities experience a decline in operational rate due to this shortage. Individual enterprises focus solely on achieving their assigned state planning tasks, underestimating their production capacity in planning and falsely reporting while demanding more resource allocation. So raw and they have raw materials actually, but not maybe necessary natural resources. But the problem is to use these natural resources, they need skills. I mean, it's not easy to just to. I mean, it's like if you have oil like Saudi Arabia, all you need is just digging the land and then getting it, and so you can just sell it. But natural resources something more need something more delicate techniques, but which North Korea doesn't have enough. So here the shortage of raw materials is they do not have enough techniques and technology to get these raw materials out of resources. That's the problem. But so that's why they suffer from shortage of raw materials. And then the thing is, every enterprise they have their assigned state plan task. So the state actually give a task. So how many steels you should produce in this era? How many some I don't know plants you should produce for a year? But they try to just focus every enterprise just focus on assigned state planning task, and then sometimes since people get lazy, right, because they did not get compensate, so they underestimate their production capacity in planning. So when government make a plan, they actually report in a wrong way. If like let's say they have a capacity to produce like 10 tons a year, but they lie that they can produce only 5 tons a year, like that way. And then sometimes they falsely report. So let's say they produce like 5 tons a year, but because there will be punishment against them, so they just lie that they produce 10 tons a year to the government. So that's the firstly, falsely reporting occurred in a lot of times, while demanding more resource allocation. So to produce more goods productions, uh, there must be necessary condition, that is resource allocations. But the resource allocation is still going on, right? So they demand resource allocation, but the government couldn't allocate the resources, but still they wanted certain productivity from the farms. That's a problem. So they clung to the accomplishment of assigned tasks rather than focusing on increasing efficiency, reducing cost, profitability, and improving labor productivity. So if you imagine you work in just a farm, in a farm which the benefit is most important, right? Then in that case you should consider cost, increase product profitability, and improve labor productivity. But in North Korean side, they do not consider cost, profits, or labor productivity at all. So it's getting worse. The speed competition of mass movement exacerbated the inefficient use and waste of resources. Nevertheless, the Charlemagne movement was the basis that could offset the inefficient use and waste of resources and achieve a relatively high economic growth rate. From the beginning, North Korea had a serious imbalance in industrial structure, and the poor social overhead capital hindered the efficient use of domestic resources. So, uh, this is kind of typical state-owned company problems. They do not care about reducing costs. They do not care about increased productivity and profitability. That's the kind of typical problems that North Korea, because North Korea firms are all state-owned, and they have to get an order from the government how much they have to produce, but they do not. I mean, capable of. They are not capable of produce that much. So that's why they sometimes lie to the government, and then the laborers, they do not have any incentives to develop their economy, so it's getting worse. So from the very beginning, North Korea shouldn't focus on only uh, the heavy and chemical industry like that, and they have to actually care other sectors at the same time, and then they actually had to implement Lieberman method anyway. I believe, the Soviet Union was collapsed anyway.